Imagine it's 4th of April 2012. You are a 77-year-old retired pharmacist living in Athens, Greece. You live in a small apartment not far from Syntagma Square, with medicine bottles in one drawer and old receipts in another. You sold your pharmacy years ago, and the pension that was meant to buy calm old age now has to cover rent, electricity, bread, and dignity. Each morning you read the papers, count your euros twice, and pretend not to notice how much less they buy than they did a few years before. Your daughters worry. Your grandchildren need help, and the country around you feels like a house whose walls are still standing, even as the beams inside begin to rot. If you have ever wondered why a pension crisis can feel slower than a market crash but hit harder than one, stay with me. What you are about to hear is not a theory, it is a pattern. It has happened before, in different countries, under different flags, and it keeps finding the same people at the same weak moment of life. And if you find value in this kind of historical clarity, subscribing takes 2 seconds and keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. That morning, Dimitris Christoulas walked to the square and shot himself near the Greek parliament. He left behind a note saying the state had reduced him to a condition where he could not find another dignified way out. His death was shocking, but the real horror was that it did not arrive out of nowhere. It came after years of pension cuts, tax hikes, falling incomes, and the slow, crushing feeling that the future had already been spent by someone else. And that is what this video is really about. Not just pensions, not just retirement, but promises made far in the past, priced as if time were endless, growth were guaranteed, and politics were honest. A stock market crash can wipe out wealth on a screen. A pension crisis can wipe out something even more basic. Monthly life, medicine money, heat in winter. The simple ability to stop working when your body has already given enough. Before we go further, there is something important to understand. Pension crises rarely look dramatic at first. There is no single moment like the bell on a stock exchange floor, no clean line between before and after. It is more like watching a reservoir drain through cracks under the mud. From above, the water still looks calm. Then one summer morning, the taps run dry. History shows that when pension systems break, they often break old, slow, and politically. Governments delay. Funds stretch assumptions. Central banks buy time. Markets pretend. And ordinary people discover, usually late, that a pension is not a pile of money with their name on it. It is a claim on a future that may be weaker, older, poorer, or more dishonest than anyone wanted to admit. A pension is easiest to understand as a bridge built from 3 materials. The first is contributions, the money paid in by workers, employers, or taxpayers. The second is returns, the growth that comes from investing those contributions over time. The third is demographics, which means how many workers exist to support how many retirees. If those 3 beams stay strong, the bridge holds. If one weakens, the bridge bends. If 2 weaken at once, people start to hear the wood crack. There are different kinds of pension bridges. Some are funded, which means money is supposed to be invested now to pay benefits later. Others are pay-as-you-go, which means today's workers are paying for today's retirees, like one row of people passing buckets to the next. Many countries use a mix of both, but every version depends on the future being strong enough to carry the past. That is the secret key. A pension is not really about old age. It is about time. It is tomorrow being asked to honor yesterday. That works beautifully when populations are young, growth is strong, inflation is calm, and politics is disciplined. It works much worse when people live longer, birth rates fall, debt rises, and investment returns are lower than the system quietly assumed. This is why a pension crisis can be worse than a crash. A crash hurts portfolios. A pension crisis hurts cash flow. A crash can hit a 35-year-old who still has time to earn, save, and wait. A pension crisis often hits a 75-year-old whose working years are already behind them. Time, in other words, is the hidden asset, and retirees have the least of it. Now here's where it gets interesting. The pension crisis is not one story. It has several masks. Sometimes it looks like inflation, sometimes it looks like austerity, which means the government cutting spending to survive. Sometimes it looks like bankruptcy. Sometimes it looks like a highly technical market problem inside pension funds themselves. But when you strip away the flags and the jargon, the same machine is usually running underneath. Too many promises, not enough real resources. And a political class that would rather delay the pain than price it honestly. Start in Germany after the First World War. The empire was gone. The new Weimar Republic had war debts, reparations, which means payments forced on Germany after the war, weak tax revenues, and a public that was exhausted and angry. On paper, the country still had savings, pensions, insurance contracts, and war bonds. In reality, many of those promises were turning to smoke. Inflation began after the war, but by 1923 it became hyperinflation, which means prices were rising so fast that money could lose value between breakfast and dinner. By November 1923, $1 was worth more than 4.2 trillion German marks. Wholesale prices rose more than 40-fold in 1922, and then more than 450 million-fold in 1923. Economist Thomas Sargent later noted that by the end of October 1923, more than 99% of all the marks in circulation had been printed that same month. The currency was no longer a measuring stick. It was a melting ice cube. Look at what happened to ordinary people. Maximilian Bern, an elderly Berliner, withdrew his life savings of 100,000 marks in 1923. Before the collapse, that money could have funded retirement. At the peak of the crisis, it bought him a final subway ride around Berlin. Then, according to the account later cited by the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, he went home and starved. This is what pension collapse looks like when it arrives through inflation. No official needs to announce, "Your pension is cut by 60%. The currency does the cutting for them. A fixed payment that once bought meat, coal, soap, and rent begins to buy bread. Then a tram fare, then almost nothing. The pension still exists on paper. The paper is the problem. And this is where history gets uncomfortable. Not everyone lost. Borrowers often did well because their debts were erased in real terms. People with access to foreign currency or real goods often did far better than salaried urban savers. Rural families with land, food, or relatives in the countryside had options. City pensioners did not. The collapse moved through society like acid, finding the softest metal. It spared people with hard assets and burned through those who trusted fixed promises. Slow thinking was punished. That was one of the brutal lessons survivors remembered. The old habits of saving in bank accounts, holding bonds, and waiting for the state to restore order became traps. The middle class, especially people who had done exactly what stable societies tell you to do, suffered the deepest humiliation. They had saved. They had planned. They had been responsible. And the responsible were treated like the last passengers still standing on a platform after the train had already left. The mechanism was simple, even if the politics were not. Germany had obligations it could not meet honestly, a tax base too weak to carry them, and a government that used the printing press as a bridge over a canyon it could not cross. That printing destroyed the very unit in which pensions and savings were measured. Imagine trying to weigh food with a scale that changes every hour. That was retirement in Weimar Germany. This matters now because pension systems are full of fixed claims. Not all of them are state pensions. Some are company pensions. Some are insurance promises. Some are municipal plans. But any promise that looks stable while the value of money is unstable is more fragile than it appears. Weimar was the extreme case, but it showed something timeless. A pension is only as solid as the money, tax base, and political order standing underneath it. Once those crack, the pension is not a fortress. It is a paper roof in hard rain. This brings us directly to Greece. But before we go further, here is something I want you to think about. If your pension were cut again and again, but the government kept saying the system was being saved, at what point would you stop believing the word saved means anything at all? Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously, because what I am about to show you next is the part of this story that most people never hear, and it changes everything. When most people remember Greece after 2010, they remember government debt, angry crowds, and endless meetings in Brussels. What they often miss is that Greek pensions were not a side issue. They were the center of family survival. In Greece, grandparents were not only supporting themselves, they were often supporting children and grandchildren hit by unemployment. When the pension was cut, the shock did not stop with one person. It rippled through entire households like a stone dropped into a shallow bowl. The Greek pension system had long been under strain. People were living longer. The country had offered generous benefits and early retirement options in earlier years. Contributions were not enough. The economy was weaker than reported. Then the sovereign debt crisis hit. Sovereign debt simply means government debt. When creditors stopped trusting Athens, the state lost room to borrow, and the promises made over decades suddenly had to compete with reality. The cuts came in waves. Reforms after 2010 raised retirement ages, tightened eligibility, and reduced benefits for current retirees as well as future ones. The 13th and 14th pension payments, which functioned like extra monthly checks, were reduced and then eliminated for many. The retirement age was pushed towards 67 by 2022. The health contribution taken from pensioners rose. According to the BBC, average monthly pensions fell to about €833 by 2015 from around €1,350 in 2009. That is not a trim. That is a life being resized. And then came the bank closures in June 2015. Cash machines were limited to €60 a day. Many older pensioners did not even have bank cards. They waited in lines for special access to small amounts of their own money. There is a famous photograph from Thessaloniki that year of an elderly man sitting on the ground outside a bank, crying. The image spread because it captured something larger than one person. It showed what happens when a financial crisis reaches the level of the body. Bent back, shaking hands, public shame. Remember Dimitris Christoulis from the opening. His death came in 2012 before the ATM lines of 2015, but it belonged to the same long squeeze. His note spoke of a country that had stripped away the conditions for dignified old age. That word matters, dignity, because pension crises are not only about survival in the narrow sense. They are about whether old people can live without becoming dependent, desperate, or invisible. The mechanism in Greece was not the same as Weimar. Inflation was not the main blade. Instead, the blade was debt plus demographics plus recession. The state had promised more than the economy could finance. Then the economy shrank. Output per person, which means the value of what the country produced for each citizen, fell sharply. Unemployment exploded, contributions weakened, tax revenues disappointed, and because pension spending was such a large part of public spending, retirees became the field where the adjustment happened. Notice the difference between a market crash and this kind of pension crisis. In a crash, a chart falls. In a pension squeeze, families reorganize dinner. Adult children move back home. Medicines are delayed. Old people lend money to younger people until they cannot. The whole social pyramid begins to rest upside down on the shoulders of those least able to carry it. And yet even here, there were differences. People with property, support networks, or incomes from outside the Greek state had buffers. People with only one income stream, one account, one promise, had none. The crisis did not treat everyone equally. It sorted them by flexibility, by assets, and by how much of their future they had outsourced to one overburdened system. This leads to the second part of this story because pension failure does not require a national collapse. It can happen inside a city. In July 2013, Detroit filed for the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history. The city had been losing people, jobs, and tax revenue for decades. This was not a sudden storm. It was more like a glacier melting beneath the building, slowly removing the ground under the foundation, until one day the walls started to lean. By the time bankruptcy arrived, Detroit had massive debts, crumbling services, and pension obligations it could not fully meet. Here is what made Detroit so important. Many Americans believed public pensions were practically untouchable. They were promises written into contracts, backed by unions, protected by politics, and wrapped in the moral force of work already done. But bankruptcy has a way of turning moral certainty into legal negotiation. For many general city retirees, the final plan imposed a 4.5% cut to pensions and eliminated cost of living adjustments, or COLAs, which are increases meant to help checks keep up with inflation. Some also faced reductions tied to annuity savings, extra savings accounts linked to the pension plan. Police and fire retirees were treated better, which is another reminder that pension crises are never purely mathematical. They are political triage. Some boats are patched first. Others are told to row harder. A 4.5% cut may not sound like Weimar Germany. It is not. But that is the point. Pension crises do not need to be cinematic to be devastating. If you are living on a fixed monthly payment, losing the annual adjustment can matter as much as the first cut itself. Inflation does the rest over time. It is like a staircase with missing steps. At first, you only stumble. Years later, you realize you have fallen much farther than the original number ever suggested. Think about the retirees involved. These were bus drivers, clerks, sanitation workers, people who had built lives around the belief that lower pay during working years would be balanced by stable benefits later. Many did not have the luxury of starting over. The city was not a hedge fund that had made a bad bet last quarter. It was their employer, their neighborhood, their tax base, and in many cases their identity. The mechanics again were simple. Detroit had too many legacy costs, which means old promises from earlier decades relative to a shrinking economic base. There were fewer workers, fewer businesses, fewer taxpayers, and a weaker city to fund commitments that had been designed for a larger and richer one. If a pension system is a reservoir, Detroit showed what happens when the pipes out remain wide, while the rivers feeding in turn to trickles. Now look beyond the United States for an even harsher version of the same political instinct. In Argentina, after the traumatic bank freeze known as the Corralito in December 2001, people learned what it meant for the state to put a virtual fence around their own money. Cash withdrawals were limited to 250 pesos or dollars per week. Years later, in 2008, President Cristina Fernández de Kirchner moved to nationalize roughly $30 billion in private pension assets. The public explanation was protection. Critics said the government wanted cash and control. Either way, the lesson was brutal. When a government is under fiscal strain, retirement savings can stop looking like sacred property and start looking like a reservoir someone in power desperately wants to tap. Detroit and Argentina look different on the surface. One was a city in bankruptcy court. The other was a national government facing severe money pressure. But both expose a truth that makes people uncomfortable. Pension promises do not sit above politics. They sit inside it. And when the balance sheet tightens, yesterday's promise becomes today's bargaining chip. At this point, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. A pension crisis is rarely just about bad luck in markets. More often, it is the bill for decades of optimistic assumptions. Growth will return. Markets will earn 7 or 8% forever. Workers will keep growing in number. Politicians will keep contributing honestly. Inflation will stay tame. People will not live too long. None of these assumptions sounds crazy on its own. Put them all together year after year and you can build a palace on fog. Most people will never know what you now know. Most people will keep trusting systems they do not understand. If you are still here, you are not most people. Hit subscribe. Because the next section is the part this channel was made for, the part they never put in textbooks. Now observe what all of these cases have in common. Germany in 1923, Greece in the 2010s, Detroit in 2013, Argentina in 2001 and 2008, even the United Kingdom in 2022, where pension funds using liability-driven investment, a strategy that uses borrowed exposure to match future obligations, suddenly faced demands for extra cash after long-term government bond yields, which are market interest rates, surged. More than £1 trillion was tied up in LDI strategies in the UK. The Bank of England said leveraged funds were forced to sell. One bank paper estimated more than £36 billion of gilt sales from the sector, and the central bank stepped in with about £20 billion of emergency purchases to stop the spiral. The same mechanism, different countries, different decades, same result. A pension system makes long promises based on assumptions about the future. If money is destroyed, as in Weimar, the promise shrinks in real terms. If the state runs out of fiscal room, as in Greece or Argentina, the promise is cut, delayed, taxed harder, or seized. If the economic base shrinks, as in Detroit, the promise is restructured. If the financial engineering inside the system becomes too clever, as in the UK gilt crisis, the pension fund itself can become a source of market panic. The surface story changes. The plumbing does not. The weak points are always some mix of demographics, leverage, inflation, low growth, and political delay. Demographics means the age shape of the population. If there are fewer workers for each retiree, every promise gets heavier. Leverage means borrowed exposure. It makes a system look efficient in calm times and fragile in fast ones. Delay means the most dangerous habit of all. Politicians do not want to admit the gap early, so they carry it forward like rot behind fresh paint. This is why pension trouble can be worse than a classic crash. A crash is often sudden and then partly repaired. Markets fall, but they can rebound. Pension crises are often cumulative. One reform, one missed contribution, 1 year of low returns, one inflation burst, one change to retirement age, one removed adjustment, one extra tax, one temporary measure, and then, after 10 or 15 years, the retiree looks down and realizes the floor has been taken away plank by plank. There is a counterintuitive fact here that many people miss. The danger does not always come when things look weakest. Sometimes it comes after long years of calm, when low interest rates and rising asset prices encourage funds and governments to believe the future has become easier. In the UK, years of low rates pushed pension funds deeper into complex hedging structures. In many developed countries, years of rising markets helped hide the size of liabilities, which means future payment obligations, because everyone assumed markets would keep doing the heavy lifting. Calm, in other words, can be the camouflage of fragility. The lake looks still because the dam has not yet cracked all the way through. And this is where history gets personal. Who gets hurt most when pension systems bend or break? Not the people with a Bloomberg terminal and 3 sources of income. Not the debtor whose obligations shrink with inflation. Not the investor who can move money across borders in an afternoon. The people history hits hardest are those living close to fixed numbers. Pensioners on fixed monthly checks are first. Middle-class savers are close behind. Small business owners who keep cash buffers instead of financial sophistication often follow. Widows, municipal retirees, older renters, people who trusted the simplest version of the deal, work for decades. Save carefully, retire modestly, depend on the check. Weimar showed how savers and pensioners can be crushed by inflation while borrowers and owners of real goods slip away. Greece showed how retirees can become the hidden welfare state for entire families until the family rescue boat starts taking on water itself. Detroit showed that even in a rich country under the rule of law, a pension promise can be cut when the tax base collapses. Argentina showed that when the state grows desperate enough, retirement assets themselves can become a target. Who walks away better? History gives an uncomfortable answer. People with hard assets, which means land, property, productive businesses, or claims that can rise with prices. People with income streams not tied to a single employer or state. People with family networks. People who understand the difference between a nominal value, the number printed on paper, and a real value, what that paper can actually buy. This does not mean the wealthy always win and everyone else always loses. But it does mean flexibility matters. In Weimar, rural households with food and barter power often fared better than urban pensioners with cash. In Greece, families with property or relatives abroad had cushions others lacked. In Detroit, retirees with outside savings or spouses with other benefits faced a different reality from those whose entire plan was the city check. In the UK gilt panic, the schemes with larger liquidity buffers, which means ready cash or easily sold assets, were less likely to become forced sellers. Now place these stories beside current conditions. Across the OECD, the number of people over 65 per 100 working-age adults rose from about 21 in 1994 to around 33 in 2024. Japan is the clearest mirror of where much of the developed world is heading. As of October 2023, Japan had 36.23 million people aged 65 and over, or 29.1% of its population. More than 20 million were already 75 or older. By 2070, the Japanese government projects that 1 in 2.6 people will be 65 or older. That is not a crisis by itself, but it is a weight, and pension systems feel weight long before they make headlines. At the same time, pension assets globally have grown enormous. The OECD says asset-backed pensions exceeded $56 trillion in 2023. That sounds reassuring. It is also a reminder that pensions are deeply tied to markets, interest rates, and asset prices. When something this large misprices time, the problem is not just a hole in one fund. It is a pressure system touching governments, bond markets, local budgets, insurance firms, and households all at once. So the human cost is not limited to retirees who already stopped working. It spills outward. Younger workers pay more into systems they trust less. Governments divert tax money from schools, roads, or healthcare to fill old gaps. Families take older parents back in. Retirement ages rise. Quiet resentment grows between generations. The social contract, the basic deal between citizen and state, begins to feel less like a contract and more like a note written in disappearing ink. That may be the most dangerous part of all. A pension crisis is not only a money problem, it is a trust problem, and trust, once burned, does not come back on schedule. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. The only question is whether you will see it before it sees you. If this channel helps you think differently about the world you live in, subscribe. It costs nothing, and it might change everything. So what did the survivors do differently? Not the lucky few who happened to guess one perfect trade. The broader group? The people who came through these periods with some stability, some dignity, and some room to breathe. The historical record shows that those who came through these episodes largely shared three characteristics. First, they did not rely on a single promise. In country after country, the most vulnerable people were those whose entire future rested on one institution staying honest and solvent for decades. Survivors usually had layers. A pension, yes, but also family support, side income, property, some cash outside the weakest channel, or the ability to work a bit longer if needed. Not because they were prophets, because they refused to stand on one leg in a storm. Second, they understood that liquidity matters. Liquidity is a simple word for how quickly you can get usable money when you need it. In Argentina, having wealth trapped behind withdrawal limits was not the same as having spending power. In the UK gilt crisis, funds that could meet collateral calls without fire-selling assets were safer. In Greece, access to actual cash during bank closures mattered more than the abstract number printed on a statement. In a pension crisis, the question is not only how much you have, it is also whether you can use it when the system seizes. Third, they adapted earlier than the crowd. This is perhaps the hardest lesson because it is psychological, which means it lives in the mind before it lives in the bank account. People who survived better tended to notice that the story had changed before the headlines fully admitted it. In Weimar, people who moved quickly toward foreign currency, barter, or real goods often did far better than those who clung to old assumptions. In Greece, families that adjusted spending early and pooled resources were less exposed than those waiting for a return to the old normal. In Detroit, retirees who understood that the city could not pay everything exactly as promised had at least some chance to reorganize before the full shock landed. Notice what this is not. It is not financial advice. History is not a menu. It is a map of recurring terrain. The point is not that one asset always wins. Different crises reward different forms of resilience. The point is that fragility has a shape. So does durability. Fragility is concentration, denial, leverage, and faith in a static future. Durability is flexibility, realism, buffers, and the humility to assume that institutions like bridges need maintenance long before the collapse becomes visible. Or to put it another way, the people who lived through pension breakdowns most successfully were usually the ones who respected promises least when promises stopped matching arithmetic. Which brings us back to Athens, back to Ford April 2012, back to a retired pharmacist standing in a capital city with decades of work behind him and not enough future left to absorb one more betrayal. Dimitris Christoulis became a symbol because his story stripped away all the technical language. No model, no policy paper, no bond spread, just a human being colliding with the endpoint of a broken promise. Most pension crises do not end in one dramatic scene. They end in quieter ways. A smaller apartment, a colder home, a delayed prescription, a son or daughter sending money back to a parent instead of saving for their own future, a retirement date moved farther away, a check that still arrives but means less each year. Collapse is not always a door kicked open. Often it is a hallway that gets narrower so slowly people do not realize they are being squeezed until they can no longer turn around. If there is one lesson history keeps repeating, it is this. Pension systems fail when societies treat time as free, when they assume the next generation will be larger, richer, calmer, and more compliant than the last, when markets are expected to do impossible lifting, when inflation is treated as harmless, when hard choices are postponed until only cruel choices remain. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. Every individual situation is different. Please consult a qualified professional before making any financial decision. This video is not for everyone. Most people will dismiss it. But if one person in your life needs to hear this, share it with them. Not because it will change the world, because it might change their world. Subscribe for more, and I will see you in the next one.